Okay, so what we're going to do in this video is we're going to have a look at coastal threats to coastal habitats and regions. So what we're going to do to start with, just going to look over some objectives. So firstly, we're going to have a look at why human populations live in coastal regions. Start to think about why is it that humans have taken these regions as places to live. Then we're going to start to identify and explain key human threats to coastal habitats. Take this further then and talk about the natural threats to coastal habitats before determining a method for assessing the impact of threats on given habitats. And I'll talk you through that so that it links to your assignment. Okay, so the first thing we want to know then is, why do people live in coastal regions? So our coastal inhabitants make up 10% of the Earth's inhabited environment is located in the coastal zone, which is quite a small percentage. But actually 60% of the global population live within 60 kilometers of the coast. So it does make up a large amount. It's quite highly densely populated. And actually 2/3 of the largest cities are located on the coastline. So this puts an extreme amount of pressure on the coastal regions. We're going to mainly focus on the UK coastline with case studies for that reason. It's more well documented. It's easier to find the evidence for your assignments, but you can look further afield if you wish to. Now, further to this, I think what we need to think about is, why have cities and towns popped up on the coastline? And there's a few really good examples. Trade and industry are two of the really key reasons why we do find cities and towns have popped up on the coast. Certainly in the UK, we rely heavily on imports and exports. Bringing goods in and out is really important. And if you can base your industry in a port or in a city that's near a port, you're going to have less costs in terms of transporting materials, raw materials in and products out, if you live in those coastal regions. Now, the other good thing about living in a coastal region, if you're in industry, manufacturing as an example, is that generally coastal areas have good access to fossil fuels that may be imported or brought in from offshore rigs, for example. So this reduces the cost of those fuel sources, and it also gives you access to cold water. And cold water is quite important. You can pump it into your manufacturing plant and you can use it for cooling processes, and this is quite good. It reduces the distance you need to move that cold water, and you can pump that cold water straight back into the ocean. Transport is another key one. Okay, so people tend to live where it's easy to get to this transport. So we might include ferries and cruise lines, things like that, coming in and out of these places. And they also create employment as well. Tourism and recreation is generally focusing now. There's a lot of it that focuses on coastal regions. People like being near the sea, beaches, and recreation to this extent relies on this as well. And you might include within that like yachting and boating and those kind of activities as well. Agriculture pops up around the coastline because generally the coastal regions are flatter, they are more fertile in terms of the soil, and therefore it's easier to grow. Certainly arables, agriculture, where you're growing plants and crops. And then the other key reason, again, if we look at Plymouth as an example, it's a defensive town, and we have a naval dockyard, and that's why the city has popped up around that particular area, and huge amounts of the population will have relied on that area for employment. So defense plays a role in this. So those are the kind of key reasons why humans live in coastal regions. What we need to think about now then is, what are the threats to these habitats? Now, the human threats we have already touched on in a previous video. We'll have a quick look over these again. Some of these do repeat things that we've just said. Industry. So these could be perhaps pollution from industry. It could be more related to other things around industry. Settlement and general development, building on coastal habitats. If you build on a coastal habitat, then it's not going to be a natural habitat anymore. You're going to remove potentially habitats for things to live on. Recreation, we'll talk about this in a minute in a little bit more depth. And tourism, they have a really big impact upon coastal regions. Fishing is quite an obvious one, in the sense that we take fish from the ocean, and that removes them from their populations, and that prevents them from breeding. And if we overfish in an unsustainable manner, then fishing can have a really big impact upon these regions. But we also understand that fishing has an impact in terms of ghost fishing, so where the netting gear gets caught on the seabed, and that can have an impact on creatures that we're not necessarily trying to capture. So perhaps turtles and other mammals like seals and dolphins can get caught up in that gear. Energy is another one that's worth considering. We talked already about the ideas around fossil fuels being imported in and out of ports, but also energy is moving towards a more renewable way of doing things, and this can include offshore and onshore wind, which can build on coastal habitats. It may include wave and tidal power as well, and those can have an impact potentially on coastal habitats, and they're worth considering. Conservation itself is a human activity, and it can have both positive and negative impacts upon habitats, especially if it's done badly. And we'll have a look a bit at that a little bit later into this unit. Sewage, perhaps from water treatment, perhaps from pollution and things like that, from maybe drainage runoff from roads, etc. This can have an impact upon coastal habitats because it may contain toxic chemicals, heavy metals, and things like that that can accumulate. Agriculture, runoff from fertilizers and pesticides can have an impact upon natural habitats. And dredging, which we did talk about in the first episode. The first episode talked about the idea that dredging is where you can remove sediments from the base of an estuary or a river, and this is to keep ports open. We dredge Plymouth Sound and we dredge the Tamar so that we can move big boats up and down that river. What you can see in the bottom right-hand image here is the result of dredging is that the sediments need to be put somewhere else. So we take ships like so, and we dump that sediment down into the base of the ocean somewhere else. That's going to impact on two key habitats there. Now, further to this, what we actually find is there are wider issues related to the economy and to society. So these are less to do with the environmental impacts, but they're more to do with people. Now, generally, what we find in this particular instance is perhaps conflict. So conflict between recreational activities. So this is where different recreational activities start to conflict and want access to the same perhaps stretch of beach, maybe a golf course or something like that, or surfers want to use an area and swimmers want to use it as well. And that can cause conflict. We do find conflict between tourists and local people. And this can be to do with a number of reasons. So it could be to do with gentrification of rundown areas. So this is where certain areas, certain towns, for example, may go through a gentrification process where they redevelop and they put money into the shopping areas, the restaurants, and those kind of things. But it means that you end up with the local people living in perhaps less gentrified areas, and they feel like they're being left out just because of the tourism. Second home ownership is another issue. This is certainly an issue in Cornwall, where people will buy a second home just to live in just in the summer, or they may rent it out. And what this means is that in the winter months, there are fewer people living in these places, in these towns and these villages, and it can have a really big impact upon the economy. The economy is almost run just on tourism alone. At the same time, we find traffic congestion can increase massively in peak time. So in the summer, traffic congestion around Cornwall is extremely much larger than it is in the winter months. Further to this, there is a strain put on local services. So hospitals and other kind of services, maybe emergency services, they find there is a much more of a strain on these services during those summer months. And it's difficult to balance that between the winter and the summer. Unchecked tourist development is another problem. This is where tourist developments may start to build on cliff tops, on sand dunes. It's really important in the local planning legislation that we start to take into account that fact. And litter and pollution are another two. These do impact on the environment, but they're generally caused by humans, of course. Okay, so those are the human threats. So what are the natural threats? Natural threats pull on some of the key ideas that we talked about in kind of episode 2 and 3 and 4. And they focus mainly on those natural physical processes, the wind, the wave, and the tidal action, the constructive and destructive processes that you've considered already. So these are ones that you might pick specifically depending on the area you pick on. So it could be longshore drift being an issue. It could be more hydraulic action on the base of a cliff. It depends on where you pick. So we'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. Now, other ones that you might consider, and these are going to affect most places, are things like coastal flooding. Coastal flooding is where perhaps you get an especially high spring tide, maybe mixed with a storm surge. Storms themselves create quite a lot of threat to coastal habitats because they increase the wave, wind, and tidal action and the power and the energy within those particular processes. I'm going to add two more to the natural threats that are worth including. These are more biotic processes, and these include pathogens and disease. So this is where pathogen disease might be introduced into an area by a non-native species, or it might be more linked to perhaps climate change and the change in the climate leading to the movement of maybe parasites into an area, or fungal infections, things like that, do actually impact upon native species. And the last one that's worth considering is invasive species. So invasive species are species that are non-native and they move into an area and they may increase predation or competition on existing native species. And this can have quite a detrimental effect on those habitats. So those are the natural threats. What I wanted to do at this point is begin to think about how we go assessing the impact of these threats. So not all of the threats are necessarily going to apply to every single habitat. So what you need to do at this point is you need to select a very specific location. So I'm going to give my example of Plymouth Sound, and I'm going to talk you through 3 threats that I've selected. I'm going to talk to you about how you go about assessing the risk of this threat causing the damage that we talk about. So the first one I'm going to talk about is petrochemical pollution. Now, petrochemical pollution as a threat has an impact upon that habitat and on the creatures that live there. So firstly, it reduces the water quality. And secondly, it can be toxic to marine life. Now, because Plymouth Sound is heavily used by shipping, by large ferries, naval ships, there's a lot of recreational activity going on which uses petrochemicals. I'm going to put the risk rating as red. I think this is a big risk to this particular area, and I think there needs to be movement to do something about it. Now, we don't need to talk about what it is that you're going to do about it, because that comes further down the line with this particular assignment. All we're doing at this stage is saying, I think this is a big potential threat to the Plymouth Sound habitat. Now, the second one I'm going to talk about is invasive species. Now, a lot of our invasive species actually come from what we call ballast water. Now, ballast water is taken on by boats to keep balance, essentially, to keep a ship buoyant. So if you have a big shipping container that's not balanced, essentially it's got more weight maybe on one side than the other side, it will take on ballast water from the ocean to balance out that ship. Now, when it dumps off its load, so for example, it could be an oil tanker that's coming into Plymouth and it drops off its petroleum into the city, and then it goes back out again to go and collect more. It's going to need to get rid of some ballast water potentially. And now the ballast water may contain lots of non-native species in that water. And this water is just dumped out into the Plymouth Sound as an example, and it may include species that will then start to put competition and predation pressures onto native species. And this could impact upon population sizes of native species. And we won't know that impact unless we go and study those creatures that live in the habitats around Plymouth Sound, which is what we're going to do in a later assignment. Now, I've put the risk rating here as amber. Okay, so I don't think it's necessarily something that's as bad as petrochemical pollution. And I think there's possibly less you can do about it, but it's still an issue. Now, the last one I've done is I've picked wind action. Now, wind action has a detrimental impact upon sand dunes and other features with loose sediment. Now, we don't tend to find these particular features in Plymouth Sound. So for this reason, I've put the risk rating as green. I don't think this particular threat has an impact upon this location. So therefore, there isn't anything we need to do about it, and it can stay as a green impact, okay, risk rating. Now, what you need to do for your assignment is you need to think about perhaps 10 of these threats. So just list them like I've done in a table. Tell me about the impact of that threat and risk rate the threat. That's all you need to do for that particular part of the assignment. Okay, try to be very specific to one location. You can base it on the location you looked at for the last assignment, but make sure that you do at least 10 different threats. You can go further if you wish, but 10 should do it nicely. Now, that is a good place to stop this particular video. If you've got any problems with it, give me a shout.